Hey everybody, welcome back to Race of History. Today I'm going to get into the second part of Potential Histories, Germany Could Not Win World War II. Again, I'm putting together a video from the other perspective of the historians that think that tactically Germany could have won World War II, but I'm trying to get in as many videos as I can of the other side of this argument before I start mine. So I'm going to do this. The last part of the Winter War series will be out later today. With all that being said, let's get into it.
Excellent work with the German Miss, Powell. Here's to hoping better sources will be used in the future. However, our intel has picked up reports of continued resistance in the comment sections. Mentions of Dunkirk and who not to invade seem widespread. We will be dropping you directly into the comment section, with your primary objective being to root out these myths. Be cautious, though. Reports indicate that the Wehrabus will be armed with Cold War-era memoirs and David Irving books. Godspeed, Lieutenant.
This video is brought to you by Dashlane. Stay secure online and never forget a password again. More on that later. So you may recall around 6 months ago, I made a video about how due to Germany's lacking in the population, industrial, and raw materials sectors, they could not have pulled out a victory in the war they started in 1939.
I actually agreed with all of the points he made. I think I agreed with all of them that he made in that video. I don't know if I completely agree. I've talked about this, that I'm on the fence about it, but I don't know if I completely agree that they couldn't have won World War II. I go back and forth on it. Certainly not everything was addressed in the first one.
And it sort of got out of hand.
I think we should read the comments.
Oh, Jesus.
The other day, as I was reading the comment section there, I found that, along with some people agreeing with me, there were a lot of dissenting opinions of yet more ways that people thought the final victory could be achieved. And I am here today to respond to them. And also probably clear up what I meant at the end of the last video, talking about limited use of alternative history. Here are a few more ways Germany could not have won World War II. One thing I have seen brought up a few times is that if Hitler had not let the British Expeditionary Force get away at Dunkirk, that later the troops could not be used during Operation Overlord and thus no Western Front, with the implication that the German troops could have been sent east to stop the Soviets. This, however, has two problems. Firstly, the BEF was not simply allowed to leave France as this narrative suggests. In Mein Kampf, Hitler does speak highly of the British at times and suggests that they could be a potential ally, but this is clearly without a strong grasp of British culture and political policy, and was always discussed with Germany being above Britain and having them be administrators of the Reich, but only if they could shake their, quote, Jewish influence. Furthermore, he realized that Britain was against his intentions in the East and would become a barrier there. All this being said, by the time of the invasion of France, Britain was definitely an enemy, and Hitler was doing them no favors. So then why Dunkirk? Well, this was an operational failing, not a peaceful gesture. On May...
Nobody knows that for certain. The operational failures in multiple different areas lead some people to think that it was purposefully done, right? I don't know if I totally subscribe to the theory that it was purposefully done, but there really is no solid discernible reason for the operational failures. That's why that's talked about in the way that it is. Although my issue with this is more that it really wouldn't have made that big of a difference in the long run. In the short run, it would kill British morale because Dunkirk was a huge morale boost for the British and all of that. But in the long run, I don't really see it being as big of a deal as this theory would make it seem.
May 15th, 1940, the Germans broke through the French 2nd and 9th armies and steamed ahead night and day, thanks in part to some tablet boys, towards the coast. Although these gains were good for the Germans, the mechanized forces were quickly running out of supplies and were leaving their flanks exposed, which opened them to being cut off, the result of which could cause ruin for the German plans.
No, that's a total misunderstanding of what's going on here. The German panzers are exposed in the way that they do warfare, right? That's the British thought literally from the beginning of the war, from the first moment the panzers left the front line, that it was ridiculous military tactics because the panzers were exposed, right? What's the quote? The turtle has stuck its head too far out of the shell. That was the thought process there, but that was just the way that they were conducting warfare with the panzers. They were exposed. I mean, they were literally almost always exposed.
It is at this point a nervous Hitler, being counseled by Generals von Kluge and von Rundstedt, gave a halt order to secure the flanks and allow the exhausted panzer divisions to refit. Check out this video by Mark Gurges for more. Upon the halt, our favorite drug-addled flyboy Goering promised the Luftwaffe could destroy the British at Dunkirk, and although he failed, I would hardly call the actions of the Luftwaffe just letting the British go. With thousands being killed, over 200 ships being sunk, over 100 planes shot down, and the loss of all the BEF's equipment, Hitler even realized that the halt was an error and resumed the attack while the evacuation was underway, and it was only successful due to the brave French soldiers that held out until it was complete. But even if he had let them go, there are still more problems asserting that this means a German victory in the war. Britain had to rearm all the soldiers evacuated, which is a huge loss and took some time. This force, when returned to England, was not in any way ready to turn around and invade France, although the troop reserves were good to have if Germany decided to invade. But they were not in fighting condition for a long time. But most importantly, Britain is not the only nation present at D-Day. A combined landing force of American, British, and Canadian forces, along with smaller groups from other countries, landed and fought on the Western Front. Although the...
Yeah, this is more my view of it. That in the long term, it doesn't have the massive type of impact that I believe would shift the war.
Troop loss, if Dunkirk had failed, may have limited Britain's number of troops. The United States, having only mobilized about 9% of its population in the course of the war, could have very realistically filled in the gaps as it did in reality with the British equipment losses. But all of this still doesn't take into account where the real war is being fought, in the East. The German army will be decidedly on its back foot after Kursk, and the Soviets have massive offensives planned in 1944 regardless of what the Western Allies do. Would the defeat of Germany have taken longer without the Western Front opening? Of course it would. But by 1944, the Soviets have a decisive upper hand and will push the Germans back to Berlin. So to say the war could have been shifted if the British had 300,000 fewer troops ignores the reality of what the Germans were truly up against by 1944.
I completely agree with that part of it. I mean, completely agree. It doesn't shift the balance of war. And in fact, the West is trying to kind of hurriedly start that front in the West because they see the tactical reality on the ground in the East, right? They see the reality of what the back and forth of the Soviets and Germans has led to, and that is the Soviets have essentially the massive upper hand, and the West can see the direction that campaign is going.
This is another one I saw a lot. Just don't invade the Soviet Union, or just don't declare war on the United States. And although these comments are puzzling on the surface, as removing a major combatant redefines what the war is and you are now describing how to win a smaller conflict, there are reasons this doesn't work that are all to do with character motivation and why these things were going to happen unless you fundamentally change who the Germans and Hitler were, and then stray into fiction. Let's first start with the Soviet Union. If you read Mein Kampf, don't do it, it's not a very good book, or listen to a lot of Hitler's speeches, both in public and in private, he fixates on this idea of Judeo-Bolshevism, which is a rather outdated term that grew out of the idea of a Jewish conspiracy that had created communism, and the two were the biggest evils facing the Aryan nation. There's a whole rabbit hole to go down here with multiple theorists and their ideas, but I'm not going to go into it here. But that's the basic idea.
Nick Cannon?
And Hitler subscribed to it. And the result of this is Hitler's main goal being to destroy the Soviet Union and become the savior of the Aryan people in his eyes, and in the process, wiping out millions of subhuman Slavs and resettle the land with Germans. Hitler saw this as his destiny, meaning he was going to do it at some point, and that this fictitious Hitler that would win World War II by not invading the East is just that, fiction. He ceases becoming the Hitler that we know and that existed, and now we're talking about a made-up story. Now,
Okay, so I'm going to be completely honest here. I don't hardly ever, and I mean ever, hear historians go this route. And the reason is the thing that you're arguing has to be like tangible, right? Like it has to be a tactical reality of moving troops around in a different way or something like that. Historians aren't psychologists, right? So the idea that they would argue that essentially that the thought process or the personality or the psychology of a country or person or whatever and the way that it influences and dictates the war and stuff like that, they try to stay as far away from that sort of stuff as possible because you just can't you can't measure it. Right? There isn't anything that you can like string together other than I think this and this is why, or I think this and this is why. But there is no like real anything tangible you can grab onto here. So this particular argument of it couldn't happen because then Hitler wouldn't be Hitler, I don't really subscribe to it. Like, I guess I don't mean that I don't completely subscribe to it, but it's just not something that I really take into account. The psychology of Hitler is not really what I'm studying when I'm studying World War II. So this argument kind of misses the point to me because there's nothing tangible you could point to say for certain like this or that about any of this. Other than like he mentions Mein Kampf, but like even that, how do you know that will absolutely 100% dictate every move of the war? You get what I'm saying? Like it kind of gets to a slippery slope there, which is why historians, for the most part, just try to stay away from it.
As to why the Soviet Union was invaded when it was, comes down to two things: resources and, frankly, paranoia. Germany, as I outlined in my previous video on this, spent a lot of the war with fairly limited oil resources and knew that it couldn't support this attack any later than June of 41 with all the fuel that the battle over Britain was consuming. And even the trade with the Soviet Union would not make up for this deficit. So the High Command felt they had to go in when they did before the army would not be able to move as they needed to finish the campaign by September, the time in which the High Command figured the Soviet Union would collapse in on itself under the weight of the German attack. And I'll point you to David Stayhill again for more information on that. The other aspect was, as I said, paranoia. I've often seen this assertion stated in a different way of don't break the alliance with the Soviet Union, although I wouldn't even frame the German-Soviet non-aggression pact as an alliance in the way you think of with the Axis.
It's not. An alliance implies allies, right? That is not what they are. They are not allies. They have a non-aggression pact. Literally that's what it is. It's a non-aggression pact. They are not going to openly attack each other, but they are not allies.
And allies. The treaty was much more in the vein of, you don't get in our way, we won't get in your way, let's trade some stuff. And it was very uneasy at many points before and during its existence.
And here's the thing, Germany's not getting nearly enough oil from the Soviet Union in this agreement, right? Like the whole thought process is Germany's getting all this oil from the Soviet Union. They are not. They are not. The amount of oil that they're getting from the Soviet Union in this agreement is a drop in the bucket. If I remember correctly, I believe they're actually getting like net more oil from Romania than they're getting from the Soviet Union under this agreement. So, yeah, that's not the way that it works. And also, Tick talked about this in that video, and I talked about it in the last video. oil is absolutely the main concern. Like, yes, they need food and they need other resources, but to maintain the type of war they want to fight, they must have oil. That is the absolute number one concern. The Soviet Union sits atop this huge oil reserve, so they make an obvious choice, regardless of what the paranoia or the relationship is with them. It makes sense to the Germans. There's a huge oil resource. Let's go get it.
Becoming most volatile during combat between German and Soviet soldiers during the Poland campaign, after the Germans overran the territory that was designated as theirs and moved into territory promised to the Soviets that actually contained oil fields, making it not very subtle what the Germans were trying to do. Both Stalin and Hitler knew that some form of war was coming, just not when and who would start it, but going out of their way for the most part to not provoke it. And they didn't trust each other whatsoever. Now, I'm not implying any kind of Suvorov preventative war type thing. The Soviet Union was refitting and probably wouldn't be ready for a large war until at least mid-1942, but with these two ideologically opposing powers taking territory so quickly right next
Yeah, at least mid-1942, at least.
to each other, it was something that was bound to happen as soon as one of them felt they were in a position to make the first move. By 1941, the Germans felt they were, and they took the opportunity. For more on this, and the German-Soviet clashings in Poland, I'll point you towards Stephen Kotkin's second book in his Stalin series, or this video of him talking about it. The declaration of war on the US is
I haven't seen that one.
bit more tricky, especially given that Hitler was aware of the industrial capacity of the nation. However, he saw the US as very internally focused and figured that it would take them much longer to mobilize than it did. Hitler always planned for war with the United States, as outlined in his second book, written but not published in 1928, but wanted to put it off until he was ready, often skipping on details about how it would be done. He began to assume that, due to some anti-German sentiments from Roosevelt, the Americans would declare war in 1942, coming to the aid of the Allies like they did in World War I. Piggybacking off the previous statements about the Soviets, he figured he
See, and this is my point with taking the writings of Hitler from Mein Kampf and wherever, and then putting it into like his personality and how it would impact the overall war. It's just hard to say, right? Like even with Dunkirk, he gives an order and then almost immediately realizes it's a mistake and rescinds it. He's very volatile. He's very back and forth. It's very hard to pinpoint what he will do or won't do based on what he's thinking or his beliefs or anything like that. So yeah, that's why I stray away from it.
could end the war in the East and turn and fight the West. This feeling ended, though, as the Soviet campaign continued to drag on and 1942 loomed. The German Navy had been asking for war with the United States for some time, as Hitler had been holding them back to not provoke them, knowing that going against the US Navy, the Kriegsmarine would come up lacking. Hitler's solution to this was Japan, which had a large navy that he thought could tie up the Americans until he was done in Russia, then turn westward and save his plan. He constantly reassured the Japanese that Germany would throw in with them if they expanded their territory south into US-held islands. This was among many attempts to get Germany and Japan to fight the same enemy, which also included trying to get Japan to invade the Soviet Union from the east in June. Although Japan kept Hitler in the dark as to when they were going to attack, Hitler was very pleased when they did and immediately lifted all restrictions on his navy to attack US ships, and later declared war a few days later after his foreign minister, Joachim von Ribbentrop, said, "A great power does not allow itself to be declared war upon, it declares war on others." Now, this decision may have been flawed with the hindsight of putting too much faith in the Japanese Navy and underestimating the US's ability to fight on two fronts and mobilize so quickly, but knowing that Hitler did plan to fight the US way back in the 20s, the timing may be bad given what we know now, but it was not something that he was just not going to do, in the same way he was not going to just opt out of invading the Soviet Union.
Yeah, but here's the thing. Okay, so the timing changes everything. That's what I don't actually understand about this. Like, I'm bringing this up in a video that I'm putting together, but timing can drastically impact the outcome of a battle or a war. We see this constantly through history. So the idea that the timing doesn't matter, it just matters who is in the battle. One, there's no way you could determine for certain that in every circumstance everybody would be in the war. That's nonsense. Again, that gets into the Hitler believes this and that and whatever. There's no way that you could logically come to the conclusion that it is 100% he is going to attack everybody in the world that ends up being in the war, right? So, but that aside, the timing of who they attack and when can make a drastic difference. That's one of the things that I'm going to point out in the video that I'm making. That's interesting to me that that's like an outright dismissal, that timing would mean nothing.
This is the one that I see the most. Take the British out before you turn east. As if it was that simple. The Germans tried this. First by attempting to bomb the British into submission, which didn't work, and second by planning the invasion of the British home island in an operation named Sea Lion. This was going to be...
Okay, so those were actually intertwined. They weren't two different things. They were bombing the British because they were trying to get air superiority in order to have Operation Sea Lion go ahead. That was the whole reason why the major flight campaign started.
The amphibious assault that would take Britain out of the war, and plans were drawn up and early preparations were made. But before going through with it, the Germans themselves realized this wasn't going to work and cancelled it. The short answer for why is the Royal Navy and the inability of the Kriegsmarine and Luftwaffe to control the channel. The German Navy would be unable to keep the channel clear.
They lost the Battle of Britain.
Of British warships to enable troops and supplies to reach the British coast unless the army's landing was on a very narrow front, resulting in less water needing to be covered. Knowing the coast was going to be heavily defended, the army rejected this plan as they would need a wide landing front so they were not just feeding men into a meat grinder. In short, the Germans did not have the material to carry out a successful landing without it either bogging down and being cut off on the ground or being simply sunk on the way to its destination. In the 70s, the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst wargamed the scenario with conditions favorable to the Germans and came up with the operation being a total failure. Some commenters have gone as far as to suggest using paratroopers to take the British down, but I think you need to only look as far as Crete and Arnhem to see how badly an unsupported airborne operation can go. The Germans would still have to land by sea to resupply them and get relief troops on the ground, and the Royal Navy was too large an obstacle to allow...
Yeah, this whole thing ties to the Battle of Britain. When the Germans lose the Battle of Britain, they don't have air superiority. Operation Sea Lion essentially goes out the window because, yeah, there's no way you can really make it fit in order to have the invasion if you don't have air superiority over the channel. So you have the Battle of Britain. Once it's decided, that's it. Any invasion plan of Britain gets thrown out the window. Maybe not immediately, but as they go through the options of each scenario, they all get thrown out.
Allow this to happen, even by the Germans' own admission. One particular comment out of all of them really stood out to me. It began with, if the Nazis weren't Nazis, they would have won. And I think this really speaks to the core of my point. Alternative history is fun. It makes for good Hoi 4 games, but when really talking about it seriously, it's really hard to come by any academic conclusions outside of a few days of speculation.
Yeah, academic conclusions don't go into personality basis, though. That's the whole thought process here, is because you can look at something like the Holocaust, right, and be like, okay, well, there's no way that anybody would have surrendered ever had they known that that was going on, so that immediately makes it to where it's untenable for Germany to have success, right? But first of all, there's no way you can just remove something like the Holocaust. Like that's impossible. Again, at that point, you're so stretching the fabric of the reality of the what if that it's whatever. But you're only handling like the tactical and strategic realities. From the academic sense, I guess, unless you're looking at this from a psychology perspective. But the idea from the historical perspective is that you have to deal with things that you can measure and see. And like Tick's video with the oil, right? Like they have to have this oil. So whatever they do and however they do it, it comes back to they have to have this oil or this amount of oil. That is how all of this is looked at. The other stuff is on like a weird science fiction sort of what if, and that's something that I I don't really get into.
Because you begin building assumption on assumption on assumption, and before you know it, you have changed the motivations and decision-making patterns of everybody you're talking about. And you are then just writing fan fiction.
This is your brain. This is your brain on
alternative history.
Would Germany have won World War II if the Nazis weren't in power? Maybe. But it's also equally likely they wouldn't have started the war, or joined the Allies, or anything else. If there's no basis in reality to do with the people you are talking about in your assumption, what's the point? Germany decided to start a war that within a little over 2 years would see them taking on 3 superpowers at once, with the resources of most of the world behind them. Add in strategic mistakes and intelligence failures, it paints a very grim picture from the start, regardless of decisions made after the fact. Speaking of intelligence failures, don't let your private information go the way of the German armies. There are plenty of
That is a great movie, by the way. God, I can't think of the name of it, where that clip was from, but it is a great movie.
Turings out there looking for information and private data that do not have the same honor and duty to country that the original did. If you're like me, you probably forget and end up reusing your password for the sake of convenience. But when you do that, it's like using the same codebooks over and over. And if one password is cracked, all your accounts could be, including banking information. Then before you know it,
Okay, so that is Germany Could Not Win World War II Part 2. I agree with a lot of what he said in there. Again, the personality stuff I don't get into or subscribe to in either direction. I do agree that once you start changing that stuff, you can go to some crazy places. But also, you can't use it to confirm biases either. Like it doesn't go either direction. That's why I steer clear of it altogether. But for the most part, the actual tactical realities of what he put out on this video, I actually agree with. The idea that the only thing I absolutely 1000% disagree with is the thought process that timing changes nothing, that everything is the same regardless of the timing of when it happens. I think that's almost nonsensical. I mean, I kind of get what he's trying to get at, that they're still going to have to fight these countries at some point, and the tactical realities are still the same. But the tactical realities aren't the same depending on the timing. That's kind of where I'm going with that. But anyway, I am going to put out the last Winter War video later today. I also am starting the recording of my video of why Germany could win World War II. None of the things that I have in it are addressed in any of the videos I've covered so far. So I'm excited about that. If anybody has any other videos they want me to look at for why Germany could not win World War II, I'm trying to get as many of them in as I can before I go to the other side of the argument and start putting out the tactical reasons why they could have won World War II. But anyway, like, comment, subscribe, help me keep building the channel over here, and I'll see you guys next time.